how Gonzaga's newcomers will fit into Mark Few's rotation, some NBA draft conversation with an expert, and analysis on Zags in the Summer League, all coming up on today's Locked On Zags podcast.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome into the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I am your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by Gametime, folks. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you'll get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Well, folks, I am thrilled to be joined today by Leaf to Lean. If you are a listener to the Locked On College Basketball podcast, you have heard Leaf and I speak off and on once a week or so for the last couple of years on that show. He's a regular guest for us, typically on our Wednesday shows. You might have also heard Leaf on the Locked On NBA Big Board podcast, checking out some draft stuff. Also been a guest host of the Locked On Jazz podcast as well. Leaf and I have spent a lot of time talking about the Zags on Locked On College Basketball or off the air, talking about the Zags. So I thought it'd be a fun opportunity to get him onto the show to share some of our thoughts. We're going to talk about this team's offseason, the players they brought in. We're going to talk a little bit about the NBA draft in particular for 2025, what we think about Michael Ajayi, Ben Gregg, a few others as well. And then we'll close out the show talking Summer League. Leaf was higher than most on Anton Watson going into the draft, and certainly we've seen a lot of positive things from him so far in a Boston uniform, so we'll get to that to close out the show. But Leaf, it's nice to see you with the Locked On Zags background behind you on YouTube here, as opposed to seeing that blue and orange in the Locked On College Basketball. Thanks for hopping on the show.
I honestly was a little confused when I joined. I was like, "Oh, did they just update?" Like I knew I was joining Locked On Zags, but I just didn't think about it. And
yeah,
I was expecting the orange and blue, but it's a pretty color. I'll give
looks
it
nice,
that.
Right?
Yeah,
yeah, it looks nice, and I always kind of theme it out with the maroon, the navy blue here as well. So it definitely fits in with with the colors. But Leaf, yeah, like I said, we've talked about the Zags a lot. I know you've seen the Zags in person a few times, obviously been at the Combine, so seen a few of the players from there as well. But you were a little bit lower on the Zags heading into last season. And while I'm sure a lot of Gonzaga fans weren't happy to hear that, a lot of the concerns you had about last year's team kind of showed up in the first part of the year. And then obviously Mark Few made some adjustments, switched the starting lineup. They kind of got used to not having Steele Venters in the mix, and things really took off in the second half of last year. And now they're coming into this season with a lot more roster continuity. You don't have a new starter at point guard because Ryan Nembhard's back. You don't have a new starter in the front court in Graham Ike because he's back. Your only new starter is Michael Ajayi, who replaces Anton Watson, which is not an easy feat, certainly on the defensive end of the floor. But looking at this roster and the fact that 4 of the 5 starters are back, feels like there's a bit more optimism heading into this season than there was last season. Kind of what's your read on that?
Yeah. Last year coming into the season, I thought Gonzaga was among the most overrated teams in the country because it was the brand rather than the players that had them ranked where they were ranked. Drew Timme was sensational. Like he was unbelievable the year before. I saw him single-handedly win the game against TCU. Mm-hmm. And then they lost Julian Strawther as well and Rasir Bolton. Mm-hmm. And so I thought I caught unnecessary flack from you guys on being low on that team. That said, Mark Few did a tremendous job fixing last year's rotation. He became a big team that had rebounding prowess, not necessarily the athletic, fast teams that have been really good for Gonzaga, that have had tremendous shooting, but he found a way to make it a really solid team, maybe less explosive than some of the best Gonzaga teams we've seen. But I thought it may have been his best coaching job in the last 6-7 years because it was a more difficult task and you had to find the right combinations as opposed to, oh, like that makes sense. We just got a 5-star freshman. Let's play him next to 4 seniors or 3 upperclassmen and a sophomore stud. And I was really impressed. This year, I'm pretty high on the Zags. The Zags come in with the same players that came up with the answers to last year's dilemma. Ben Gregg inserted into the lineup, brought in size. Braden Huff was a pleasant surprise from the beginning of last year throughout the season. You retain, like you said, Andrew Nembhard. Ike comes off a season in Spokane, has played the entire season, is healthy this time. There aren't concerns about, is his foot all right? Like, you know what you're getting there. You probably, one of those two players between Nembhard and Ike is likely going to be your WCC player of the year.
Yeah.
And then you bring in a guy who was among the best players in the WCC that didn't wear a Gonzaga roster, Gonzaga jersey last year, I should say, in Ajayi. So I think they're a top 10 team pretty comfortably, honestly.
I want to talk more about Ajayi a little bit later from kind of a draft perspective, but I also want to talk about one of their other newcomers on the roster, because first of all, I agree. And I think looking at last year's team and saying, well, they made the Sweet 16, so Leafs preseason thoughts were wrong. Like that's not really a valid way to look at it. I think a lot of the concerns that you and others had brought up ended up coming to fruition. But like you said, Mark Few is a genius, and he had one of the toughest. We talked about it on the show a few times last year. I think that might have been one of the toughest coaching jobs that Mark Few's had, at least in the recent, like, really successful Gonzaga basketball era. And he answered the call in a tremendous way. But we've also seen Mark Few be very proactive in addressing some of the concerns via the offseason. I mean, they added Michael Ajayi before the season was even over. They were still in the NCAA tournament when they got a commitment from Michael Ajayi in the portal. And then they go out and add what I thought was a huge gap area for the team last year in the kind of backup guard spot. And that was Khalif Battle coming over from Arkansas, a guy who spent time at Butler, spent time at Temple, was averaged 29 and a half points a game over his last 7 contests with Arkansas, dropped 42 in a game against Vanderbilt. And not only does he fill just a need for Gonzaga as a third guard, they just didn't have anybody in that role, especially during the 6 weeks of the year where Luka Krajinovic was hurt last year, but he also has a skill set that Gonzaga really didn't have last year, and that's rim pressure. He can get to the rim. He can put pressure on opposing defenses. He draws contact. He gets to the free throw line. This stat blew me away, Leaf. He made more free throws last year for Arkansas than Graham Ike, Gonzaga's leading free throw attempter. He made 50 more free throws than Graham Ike attempted last year. That is how dramatic Khalif Battle's ability to get to the rim is. And when you look at guards like Ryan Nembhard and Nolan Hickman, who are not like awful in that area, but that's not really their strength. And you look at previous years, Julian Strawther was better at getting to the rim and using that little floater. Bolton had that in his bag. And Nembhard and Hickman, that's not really their game. But now they have a third guard who can provide that, who can do that, who can put that pressure on defenses. It feels like, from a depth perspective, it's obviously a huge addition for Gonzaga, but I think from a skill set perspective, it really gives Mark Few another area offensively to attack opposing defenses.
Yeah, that segues beautifully into what I wrote down on my notes. I wrote down that athleticism and dynamic athletes made Gonzaga's best teams. Like, there have been some awesome teams that shot the ball well, that played through the interior. You could even say, like, Karnowski. That's not an athlete, but that team played beautifully. The true best teams that Gonzaga had, in my opinion, and you guys can argue with me, and I'm happy to entertain this, are 2019 and 2021. 2019, you had Rui Hachimura and Brandon Clark, who were just different level athletes than anyone you played other than Zion Williamson and RJ Barrett that year. That entire year, those were the 2 of the best 4 athletes in all of college basketball. Then in 2021, you bring in Jalen Suggs, and the whole dynamic shifted, because he was able to put pressure on the rim and be skillful and run the show along with an already excellent cast. Battle's not that. Ajayi's not that. But what you add is you have tremendous size and guys who play their role excellently, can space, they're really skilled, and they're athletic for their position. Not at the elite level, but they're 80th percentile athletes in Ben Gregg, because he's huge, but he can move 3 through 5 in your lineup. You have the same luxury with Huff. You have the same luxury with Nembhard in a different sense, that he's really quick. He creates for others using his quickness. Ike is a far better athlete than he's given credit for, because he came off an injury last year. But in comparison to the rest of the WCC, he's a dominant force. And now you bring a guy who brings unbelievable rim pressure and dynamic, I wouldn't say fast twitch athleticism, but kind of, he barrels into you. He puts the pressure on your defense incessantly. And that's really great. That's why I have so much faith in Gonzaga. If you can figure out how last year to make a team go to the Sweet 16 and play Purdue closely, I know it didn't end up very close, but that was an interesting game. That means that he can really figure out how to make a jigsaw puzzle out of 7 deep this year. That's way better than last year's roster. Way, way, way better. And as for Ajayi, I don't think he fit in at the NBA Combine, because he wasn't used to playing that level of athletes that were better athletes than him, but he's huge. He's no skinny guy that's really skillful that Pepperdine's had before. Like think of Houston Millette. You think of Kessler Edwards.
Javon Porter was like that too. Yeah.
Exactly. All these guys were thinking. Ajayi is very thick and solidly built, and he used that nicely. That was his best attribute at the combine. You put him back into college ball on a team where he's not asked to do everything. In fact, I think he's probably the third or fourth best player on Gonzaga. That's a really, really good team. So hopefully Zags fans don't hate my takes this year, because last year I still think I was right. I know they made the Sweet 16, and I told Andy, and I'll own it. This is the year they don't make the Sweet 16. That said, they got a dilapidated Kansas, and I picked Gonzaga to the Sweet 16. This year's team, far, far better. I'm very excited to watch them and root on the Zags again. It's a team I enjoy watching, and few, like you said, excellent coach, made the proper adjustments. This year he's got the artillery. I'm excited.
You talked about Ajayi there, and that's a perfect segue into what I want to get into next, which is a bit more about what we did see from him at the combine, what we maybe didn't see from him at the combine, and what for him to be able to be somebody who sneaks into that draft. Zags have had player drafted 4 years in a row. Next year's 5, and Ajayi is kind of the main option in terms of continuing that streak for Mark Few and the Zags. So Leaf and I, we're going to talk about what that looks like for Ajayi, maybe some other guys who might end up sneaking into that draft conversation, either this upcoming season or in previous years. And we got all that coming up after a word from today's sponsor, Gametime. Folks, minor league baseball season is here. And as somebody who lives about 10 minutes away from a local stadium, I love being able to make a last-minute decision to go head out to the ballpark. And that's why I use Gametime. Because, folks, prices on the Gametime app, they actually go down the closer it gets to first pitch. So with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and their lowest price guarantee, Gametime takes the guesswork out of buying tickets. And if you're somebody who's concerned about buying tickets from a third-party app and having them not be legitimate, with Gametime's ticketing coverage, your purchase is covered by the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. Personally, I love having that peace of mind. So folks, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. You can get 2 tickets to a local minor league team for like $30. You can get them for $10 if you use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off. Terms do apply. So download the Gametime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. All right, Leaf, want to continue the conversation that we had there at the end, talking about Michael Ajayi specifically. You saw him at the combine. You mentioned that he's a bigger bodied guy, that he hadn't had a lot of experience playing against some of those high level athletes. And I think that was kind of one of the things that we expected to be a bit of a knock on him. Obviously, he'll play a lot of the same teams at Gonzaga in the WCC, but he has a much stronger non-conference schedule. He'll also get a chance to play in the NCAA tournament, and we'll get to face some of those opponents. But from what you saw from him at the combine, from any games or highlights you watched from him at Pepperdine, what are kind of the things that you expect to see him do well at Gonzaga, and maybe some things that for him to be draftable next year, he will have to demonstrate well with Mark Few's program?
What I'd say his best attributes is he's maybe not a master of any one trait, but he's good at a lot of them. And so you can plug him into a lot of holes. Like Anton Watson and he are not the same player. Ajayi and Watson are not 1-1, but they are similar in the sense that you can play them in different roles and expect similar production. Like it's not going to take away from his points and rebounds total if you ask him to guard the best offensive threat on the opposite team. If you ask him to score and spot up, I'm not going to say he's a great shooter, but he knocks down open shots. Like there's a reason he was an 18-point per game scorer at Pepperdine. Yeah, like he knew how to score against WCC competition. That's not going to change if you lower his role, you lower his usage rate. I think that's going to help him. I think he's going to knock down open shots. Now, is he a dead-eye? Absolutely not. But I think he's the type of guy that Gonzaga fans should look forward to seeing attack closeouts, create the right shots for teams, because you have another guy who's used to having the ball in his hands, now taking a complementary role, and he'll have open shots. He'll be able to get to the rim, attack, dump off to a big guy like EK, kick out to Huff. These type of things, they all fit complementary to one another. I'm curious to see what the best lineup is for the Zags, because I personally thought Gonzaga's season turned around, and I'm sure you guys talked about this all the time when Gregg entered the lineup. Now the question is, do you play Gregg with EK and then with Huff, or do you play Ajayi and then when's Battle come in? And because you don't want to be too redundant of having, I would say, a relative non-shooter in Battle, a slasher, play with Ajayi, or do you want to play Huff? And I'll let Mark Few answer those questions. But I think the question will be, how do you best utilize players that are used to a high usage in Battle and Ajayi in order to best win and not just win the WCC? Because St. Mary's last year was really good, lost Mahaney, and though Marshallonis was the player of the year, Mahaney is what made their engine go.
Yeah.
This is about winning those preseason tournaments like Gonzaga has in years past. They need to see this as a team that's comparable to the team that they fielded in 21, 22, and probably more like 22. I don't think they're quite as good as 21, but that's the way they should envision this, as opposed to being better than last year.
Yeah, and what I like about Ajayi is that, again, not a one-to-one comparison to Watson, but one of the things that was nice about Watson is that you could kind of play him at the 3 or the 4, and it's what allowed Ben Gregg to step into the starting lineup, because Gregg is built like a power forward. He looks like a power forward, but he can also space the floor. And so you had some options with him on the floor, and Ajayi kind of offers that same thing, where Ajayi's 3-point kind of situation is very similar to Watson's in the sense that his percentage last year was pretty good. I think people, if you just look on Basketball Reference, you see his percentage, you say, wow, they're saying he's not a great shooter. Well, his volume was pretty low. And so he, like Leaf said, he knocked down open threes, which is great. You want him to be able to do that, but you're not expecting him to be a guy who hits 40% on 6 attempts per game or even 4 attempts per game. But if he can shoot 40% on 2.5 attempts per game, which he's proven he can, that's huge. That's excellent. And it's enough that, again, defenders come out on him. He attacks closeouts. He drives to the rim. He scores that way, or he dumps it off. Like, he's got a lot of versatility in that game. And I think you will also see him play a lot at the 4, because I think Gonzaga is going to run those 3-guard lineups with Nembhard and Hickman and Battle all on the floor at the same time. And I think if you do that lineup with Ajayi at the 4, then you can run any of Huff or EK or Gregg at the 5 if you want. And just, especially if it's Ben, you're just going. Ben's none of those 3 guys are speed demons necessarily, but with 4 quick guys on the floor and somebody who can space the floor like Ben or Braden, you have just really dynamic offensive lineups in that situation. And then if you want to switch it up and you want to go Ben at the 4, Michael Ajayi at the 3, heck, you could go Steele Venters or Dusty Stromer at the 2 and just have these like really jumbo lineups too. Like, Mark Few just has this insane amount of options. And we talked about why Ajayi's versatility plays into that, but so does Ben's. And I know, Leaf, you're a big Ben Gregg fan, and you've talked about that with me before. And I don't feel like he's really shown up a lot on the NBA draft radar yet. And I think there's some reasons for that. And obviously his playing time hasn't been super significant until the second half of last year. But he's 6'10". He shoots 38% from 3. He's insanely efficient as a 2-point scorer. He has improved physically as a defender. Like, Killian Tilly made the NBA, and Ben Gregg strikes me as somebody who's similar to Tilly. He's not quite as good of a 3-point shooter, but he also doesn't have the injury history hanging over him the way it did for Tilly. So I kind of see I don't think it's that hard to see a path where Ben Gregg is an NBA player. And I'm curious kind of what your read is on that, having seen him kind of take on that bigger role last year.
I mean, I think it's interesting. I hadn't thought about it too much. I mean, the pitch is simple. Like you said, 6'10", 38 from 3, pretty solid defender, and he's evolving. The difference between he and Tilly, to me, even more so, like, Tilly was a better shooter, but Tilly just was unbelievably skillful with the ball. He could score inside, he could score outside, was an excellent passer, okay defender before his body gave out on him. And even when it did, he still found a way to be impactful with smarts, rebounds. So Tilly was the better player. But Gregg has that appeal. The reason I love Ben Gregg is every time he plays hard, and he changes the game. Like, even when he played sparingly last season, like meaning when Gonzaga played TCU and I saw them play GCU and TCU, he started hedging screens, and that was the change of the game. Like, Mike Miles was able to go downhill and attack Timmy. Timmy didn't want to foul. And then they'd kick out, and if TCU could hit the broadside of a barn, they had a really good chance to win that game. Chuck O'Bannon may have saved Gonzaga. But then you look at Ben Gregg, he comes in, energizes, then all of a sudden the defense shifts because Gregg hedges a few screens, and then Timmy started doing it and changed the look. And then this year he gets more minutes. He plays the 3. He's huge. You think, okay, now he's got to guard the perimeter. He rejuvenated Gonzaga. Like, I think he brought this energy. from an outside perspective, not watching every game, but watching
Mhm.
quite a few games. He brought
Mhm.
this energy that made them play better. He plays unselfishly, hits open shots, doesn't need the ball very often, and defensively became an anchor to a team that I think lacked I would say a guy who spoke to the team and
Mhm.
was like, you know what, we're going to defend every possession.
Yeah.
Watson did it every possession, but the guards I don't think did it so often. Gregg
Mhm.
brought this energy and enabled them. I also totally forgot about Stromer and
Mhm.
how much better he got at the end of the year. In my
Mhm.
head, I was like, okay, I'm missing someone that is going to play the two guard because I
Mhm.
was just going through the lineups in my head. And Stromer was a significantly better player at the end of the year as well. He and
Yeah.
Gregg improved the most. And you add him to Ajayi, who can
Mhm.
play 2 through 4, like you said.
Mhm.
Battle can probably play 2 through 4 if you stretch
Mhm.
it.
Mhm.
And you already have Nemhard and Hickman, and I love Nemhard. I've loved
Mhm.
Nemhard for years.
Yeah.
And then you have all those the host of big guys. This might
Mhm.
be one of the most evenly weighted deep teams Gonzaga's
Yeah.
has. You don't have the star power of Suggs. You don't have a
Mhm.
Kispert, but this is a really, really solid team. And the more I think about it,
Mhm.
once you find out the best lineup, which I
Mhm.
think you need to figure out earlier in the season to push up your true chances to win, because this is going to be one of those good years in college basketball where there's a
Mhm.
lot of good teams as opposed to, okay, there's a few middling teams and there's a few that break away from the pack. I think there's going to be 8 to 10 really solid teams this year.
Yeah.
I think you need to find your good lineup early, play some of these big teams and the teams that can match you physically before WCC play, find that lineup. And I've got true optimism for Gonzaga.
Yeah, not only do you have Stromer, hopefully in the mix as the player that he was in the second half of last year, and we saw, I don't always trust when new rosters come out. They, people are like, oh, they gained so and so pounds, and like I don't always know that I how much I trust that. But Dusty Stromer needed to put on some weight, and reportedly he did put on about 8 to 10. So hopefully that will help him just from a physicality perspective, be able to attack the rim a little bit more than he did last year. But you also get Steele Venters back too, and I think that's an interesting kind of wrinkle. He's good at one thing, and he's really, really good at it, and that's spacing the floor, shooting the three. And I
And you
think having
needed
him
it
in the
last
mix.
year.
Hmm?
And you needed it last year. Like
Yeah.
last year, there was no great shooters.
Yeah,
And though
absolutely.
Nemhard would
And
get to the rim,
mhm,
though EK was a force at the rim, no one could shoot the ball. And when
yeah.
I say that, I don't mean, oh, Anton Watson and his
Mhm,
percentage was bad. I'm well aware it was a good percentage, but
mhm,
that's because the defense likes when Watson ends up being
right.
the final shooter more than
Yep.
they like when a Kispert ends up being the shooter that you
Right.
design plays for. You need to have a stretch of the defense. There's vertical rim spacing that you had in a Brandon Clark.
Mhm,
Then you had guys who took up presence at the rim, like Timmy, even though
mhm,
it wasn't above the rim finishing, you had to gravitate toward him. Gonzaga had Strawther with Timmy, and that's why you couldn't help off one side of the floor. Even Bolton.
yeah.
Last year, they didn't have the presence of Timmy,
Mhm,
nor did they have a shooter even comparable to Julian Strawther.
yeah.
This year, you get the guy that was supposed to be the shooter,
Mhm,
and you get the guy who inherited the reins of the shooter in Stromer,
mhm,
and you get two players that are probably better players than both Stromer and Venters in a
mhm,
vacuum in Ajayi and Battle,
mhm,
and so that's what few lacked. We talked about what Kansas lacked: couldn't shoot, didn't have enough players that could do stuff with the ball.
mhm.
Gonzaga exposed them for it. Well,
Yep.
what'd they do? Get four wings in the portal?
Yeah.
Gonzaga did a similar thing.
Yeah.
Just two of them were in house.
Mhm. Well, I want to close up the show, kind of moving on from the current roster and talking a little bit about some of the guys we just talked about Julian Strawther, about Drew Timme, about Anton Watson, because all those guys and Killian Tilly played in the summer league this year, and I want to kind of see what your thoughts were pre-draft, at least in the case of Anton Watson, and kind of how we expect those guys' NBA seasons to shake out based on how they did in the summer league. So we're going to get to that in just a second. But first, I want to tell you all about today's sponsor, eBay Motors. Passion, drive, patience. That's the formula for winning championships, and it's also what helps keep your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything that you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. From superchargers to roof racks, exhaust kits to LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. Plus, with eBay's guaranteed fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your car every time or you get your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that W. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only, exclusions apply, and eBay's guaranteed fit is only available to U.S. customers. All right, folks, segment 3, Andy Patton here, Leaf to Lean, Locked On NBA Big Board, regular guest on Locked On College Basketball as well. And we want to talk a little bit about the guys in Summer League. And Leaf, let's start with Anton Watson. He's come up a handful of times in the show, obviously a big part of last year's roster for Gonzaga. I know pre-draft you had him in your 40s on the big board. Most places did not have him in the top 60. A lot of people were surprised to find out that he got drafted, notably including the people who were in studio who called him Anton Watson, which was a little frustrating. But he goes to the Boston Celtics at 54 overall, 2 years in a row that the defending NBA champions have taken a Zag in the draft, including Julian Strawther the year before. We saw Brad Stevens talk about Anton Watson. They mentioned wanting him to shoot more, which I think makes sense when you figure that they probably identified him as a prototypical 3-and-D wing if he can knock down those corner threes with any level of consistency. We saw him in the Summer League. The three-point shot looked fine at times. He took a lot of them, which is what they wanted him to do. When you look at his skill set and kind of potential fit in the NBA, and specifically with Boston, like this feels like a good landing spot. It's not going to be open to a ton of playing time, but certainly a spot where he could really thrive if given that opportunity. What did you kind of think about him going to Boston?
Boston's the best landing spot for both he and Baylor Shireman, because all you're asked to do in Boston is shoot the three when it's available. And Boston shot the most threes in the NBA and shot a pretty good percentage. They didn't shoot the best, but they got a ton of great looks because they have individual creators that get you good shots. They play a great brand of defense, one, because they have the personnel, and secondly, because they're analytics driven. Like that's going to fit right into what Anton Watson wants to do.
Yeah.
Switch, be versatile, rebound, shoot the open three. That's all he has to do. Run the floor hard, all of which he'll thrive in. I mean, Shireman, I made this pitch a million times for. It's the same pitch for Watson. I said, well, Shireman got 9 rebounds a game, and he shot open threes at 38%. Watson, I guess technically, had better numbers from three and similar numbers rebounding. Shireman's a far better shooter. Right. But the pitch is the exact same. Play hard, defend different positions, play intelligently, and you'll get rewarded on that team. And so I had him 46th. I like the versatility that he brought. I think it was obvious if you watch Gonzaga, what made them work. He was the engine for the entirety of the season. Ben Gregg was the catalyst for the second half when Gonzaga started playing better. And Anton Watson, his role evolved every single year. He was the guy that you're like, oh, like I wonder why he's playing on the Jalen Suggs team. Like it made sense if you watched enough Gonzaga, but he didn't have the flash, the flair that some of the other guys on that team had. And you're like, well, they already have Ajayi, in this case, Joel Ajayi, not Michael Ajayi. Joel Ajayi was their kind of like do everything guy. Well, that's what Watson eventually evolved into, just a bigger version with the ball less frequently. And so he got all the applause. But as he grew, in terms of year to year, you had that same appeal that everyone lauded Joel Ajayi for. And Watson's praise just wasn't there. But if you watch a ton of college basketball like you and I do, it became pretty obvious who was able to enable Timmy to be successful, who was able to help Ryan Nembhard, who was able to help Graham Ike last year. Even though they get the headlines, I think the engine of Gonzaga was Anton Watson, and all he has to do is play hard. It's the same role, and he's got significantly better players than compared to even the competition. The Celtics were the best team by a mile all year.
Want to talk Julian Strawther as well here, a guy who only played 2 summer league games, but Denver had a very intentional strategy with Strawther. They brought him in to feature him in more of an on-ball role to kind of let him showcase the skills that he might have in a role that he didn't have in Denver and frankly didn't have at Gonzaga either. He was always a complimentary piece. He was never really the on-ball player, but he did that for Denver in 2 summer league games, and he averaged 28.5 points a game. He dropped 32 in one game, 25 in the other, and he just looked excellent. He looked significantly better than the competition around him. And that's not stunning for second-year players, but for a second-year player who was a late first-round pick, who was injured for part of his rookie year, I think it caught a few people off guard. And now you look at a Denver team that obviously is still absolutely stacked with talent with Jokic and Murray and Porter and everybody, but they do have an opening at the 2-guard spot with Caldwell Pope out the door. Most people expect Christian Braun's going to step into that role, but Strawther Strawther's now a strong competitor, if not for the starting role, at least for a significant role for this Denver team next year. And he sure looked the part in Summer League. I was very impressed, not only by the fact that he shot the ball well, which we know he's capable of doing, but that he kind of shined in a role that we haven't really ever gotten to see him play, since he was in high school.
Well, the question for Strawther is physically, can he be the defender?
Yeah.
Christian Braun is a Christian Brown, I should say, is a top tier athlete. And I know you don't typically get that of a white guy. You don't think that, but he's a better athlete than KCP or Bruce Brown were.
Yeah.
And so he may not be as adept at learning when to cut like Bruce Brown was, or as good a shooter as KCP is and was for the Nuggets. It's going to be about how much they need the defense and the physicality that Christian Brown can provide versus the incentive that Julian Strawther can. How much better of a shooter is he than Christian Brown?
Right.
Like, that's the question. How close is the defensive disparity versus the shooting disparity between those two players? And I think it'll be Brown because he's bigger, he's stronger, and he's not a terrible shooter. In fact, at Kansas, as I would constitute him as pretty much a dare shooter on that team, honestly, even though he shot 40% and he actually had decent volume. I mean, college doesn't mean everything. And then how real is Julian Strawther's ability to shoot in an NBA game? With closeouts being higher, he has a slightly low release, which is something I critiqued him for entering the NBA draft. I still wasn't overly low on him. I was lower than some, but it's how real is his NBA shooting, and there's no better team to be an NBA shooter on than the Nuggets.
Yeah.
Because you're going to get great looks all the time. So I think he's got a good pathway to the floor, and it's between he and Peyton Watson as kind of the next wing. And Watson got benched in the playoffs because he couldn't shoot. So insert Strawther, and he's got a chance.
Yeah. And I think it's a matter of who you want kind of in the second unit versus not. And Braun, I think, makes more sense as a starter with the defensive abilities, whereas Strawther coming off the bench and not necessarily leading the second unit, but being a more score first option on that second unit feels like it makes a lot of sense to me. But Leaf, we are a little short on time, so I want to get to the last guy here, Drew Timme, of course. Played with Sacramento in the summer league. And honestly, Drew he did what I expected him to do, which is a good thing and also not necessarily a good thing. He's just a prolific low post scorer. We know that. What I love about Drew Timme's developing offensive game that I want him to get more credit for is that he is, like, people look at him and think, well, we're not just going to run and funnel an offense through a low post scorer, so he's not going to thrive. And that's the same argument people make with Zach Edey too, of like, well, if we're not going to, pound the ball down on the block, what can you do? Well, Edey proved it, and Timme has proven it on a slightly smaller scale of, like, they can set screens, they can facilitate the offense. Drew Timme is a very good passer. He developed so much as a passer in his 4 years at Gonzaga, just a something he really doesn't get enough credit for. And so while I think that the offensive versatility is better than he gets credit for, ultimately, he's still not a three-point shooter, and he still doesn't have the lateral mobility or the verticality to be an impactful defender. And while I desperately believe that he deserves a shot in the NBA, those two things are still problematic. And I don't know if the shooting even necessarily how much that would help him, because the defense, I mean, if he's got to run drop coverage and he's not going to be able to challenge shots at the rim as capably obviously, certainly as a guy like Edey or other guys, that feels like it's going to be a pretty big hindrance. But he looked great in summer league. He is obviously a fantastic player. I really hope that somebody can find a way to utilize his skill set at the next level. But I still have my concerns about him, particularly on the defensive end.
Yeah, he's never going to play much in the NBA just because he can't defend. He's a poor lateral mover and a non-factor at the rim as a rim protector at the NBA level. He's amazing with the ball in his hands, and he's got similar skill set to what Domantas Sabonis is in the NBA now on a scaled down version. Sabonis has those same warts on defense. He's not a good defender, but he's just that great on offense, and he's a little more athletic than Timme. Timme is a really good passer. I'm glad you brought that up. And even if he improves his shot, which he did throughout his time at Gonzaga, and he did since he's been in the NBA, I don't think it matters all that much. The best example is Jonas Valanciunas led the NBA in three-point percentage for a season. Who cares? Because he shot 2 shots a game that the defense let him shoot.
Right.
So that's how Timme would be treated. And that would be the unfortunate factor to me, that You're not going to play someone who doesn't play defense either at the perimeter because he's too slow-footed or doesn't protect the rim. So I think he's kind of in no man's land. He'll always be an excellent player at the tier below the top end in the NBA, but I don't think he ever cracks really the true rotation of a team in the NBA.
Yeah, I really just hope he gets a look, and I think he will. Like I think he'll play in the NBA, but yeah, his ceiling is fairly limited, and I think that's to the detriment of teams even being willing to give him a shot. If you're going to use your last roster spot or a two-way on somebody, you want them to have a higher ceiling, and his floor might be higher than some of the guys who get on those two-way contracts, but his ceiling is just unfortunately capped, and I think that's going to forever be kind of held against him. Leaf, thank you so much for coming on the show, man. We record at this time pretty much every week. And since Isaac and I took care of our shows this week, we thought, hey, let's just bring you on for Locked On Zags. I thought it turned out great. I was excited to get to hear your expertise and your thoughts on this team. So looking forward to the season. We're still a few months out, of course, but calendar's about to flip to August and we're getting there. So looking forward to another great year chatting with you on Locked On College Basketball. Folks, if you want to hear more from Leaf, check out Locked On College Basketball. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Check out Locked On NBA Big Board as well if you want to get some insight into some of these high-profile draft players in college basketball next year. The VJ Edgecombe, the Cooper Flags, the Ace Baileys, whomever it may be, all those guys and more covered on Locked On NBA Big Board. It's going to wrap it up for us today. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or your first watch of the day. We'll be back later this week with more Olympic coverage, more recruiting, more NBA draft, all sorts of fun stuff coming your way on Locked On Zags. Until then, as always, go Zags.